This is gonna take Cracker Jack timing, Wang.
Total concentration. You ready, Jack?
I was born ready.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. It's time for another comic book creator retrospective. This is probably the first time. No, it's not probably. This is the first time we've done a creator that's specifically just an artist. Although Gil Kane has definitely written some in the past. Yeah. He's mostly known as a comic book artist. And in fact, I believe this might be Joe Corallo's favorite comic artist of all time. Am I right on that one, Joe?
It's he's definitely up there. He might be. I know it's Breen. Breen's an all-time favorite, and we both like Gil a lot. He's one of the best to ever grace the pages with his pencils, and more people should be talking about him.
And as Joe mentioned there, the other member of the team is going to be the man so cool they call him the Breen, the comic book hoarder himself, Eric Breen. Is Gil Kane your favorite comic artist of all times?
Yes.
There you go. I guess I got him mixed up. I know Joe loves him as well. It's right up there.
How could you not love Gil Kane? It's crazy.
Absolutely. He's completely done a massive amount of work at DC Comics, done a massive amount of work at Marvel Comics, Eisner, Comic Hall of Fame, Harvey Award winner, Jack Kirby Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, he left us about 21 years ago, I believe in the year 2000. Fortunately, he was inducted before that happened, but the amount of things this man has worked on is it's amazing. Obviously, he really got his start on like the Green Lantern kind of stuff in Showcase 22. What are your thoughts about his early work at DC Comics, Joe?
Well, yeah, I mean, Gil Kane has described himself as he was one of the early people in the second generation of comic artists, which were fans. People who grew up or were reading comics, like original floppy comics, before they got into it. Because the generation before that, it was you were newspaper strip artists. And they were only the golden age. We were just starting to get original comics that weren't just reprints in newspaper strips. So Gil Kane was from that generation of artists who were reading original floppy comics that were designed for the floppies. So he had that unique perspective going into it. And he was able to go into revamping Green Lantern with having the Flash just being rebooted as well. So there was a lot of energy behind all of that. I think that was Bob Kanigher writing Flash, doing the reboot there, and it's John Broome over with Green Lantern. But everything people associate with Green Lantern, with Hal and all of that, so much of it is all Gil. I mean, he was on that book, I think, over 5 years straight. And, if we're talking Hal, we're talking Oa, Sinestro. Those are all Gil Kane.
Guy Gardner.
Yeah.
Biggest douchebag in DC Comics as far as heroes go.
Yeah, he designed the Guardians.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All that stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible how much he got involved in doing that. And when you think about it, Hal's costume, he designed so well, they barely altered it over the years.
Yeah, it's the perfect color combination. It's like the perfect amount on each side. It just looks cool, no matter what you do with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it looks awesome. And obviously, he would have created Adam as well with Gardner Fox. So he did a lot of really cool stuff at DC Comics. He's worked with kind of all the best, and he kind of he's a bridge breed between that first generation of writers and like that third generation of writers. Like he's working with Gardner Fox, but he's also working with Marv Wolfman, kind of later on.
Yeah, he he first got on my radar because I didn't see this, the DC stuff until later on. When I first started reading comics, he was basically the house cover artist, which he'd been for about 5 years already at the time. fact, I said 1972 when Marvel did the Border covers, and he did probably over 50% of them, and he would always have a limb, like a hand here or a foot there, bleed over into the border. Yeah, he just did so much great cover work. But he at Marvel, he was the artist on the 3-issue Spider-Man story that the government asked them to do that the code didn't approve, the Harry Osborn on drugs story, Green Goblin. So he worked with Stan, he worked with all the writers at Marvel, Roy. I mean, so because I know at Marvel he had a hand. He helped co-create Iron Fist with Roy Thomas and helped revamp Adam Warlock. So yeah, he was very prolific, at DC in the 60s and then Marvel in the 70s, and then back to DC after that, where he, as Joe and I we've done a retrospective, the Wolfman Gil Kane Action Comics storyline.
Yeah.
So I mean, he worked with everybody. And
well, before he left Marvel, he ends up succeeding John Romita Sr. as the next Spider-Man artist. And he obviously is working with a young man named Jerry Conway for one of the most iconic moments in comic book history, the death of Gwen Stacy. Joe, we talked about it here on the channel. That is one of the most beautifully illustrated stories you'll ever see in your life. And when Peter loses Gwen, even though he's got the mask on, you can see the anguish. He's such a fine artist. And then the moment, like when it's happening and the falling and everything, you feel the dread as you're turning the pages.
Yeah, I mean, those are. It's interesting because Gil Kane, unique in comics history, was there at DC to spawn the Silver Age. He was easily, you can't argue that he was one of the architects when he redesigned, Green Lantern and worked on that with John Broome, that was, launching comics into the Silver Age and this new age of superheroes. And then he was the artist on what many people consider to be the birth of the Bronze Age and the end of the Silver Age with, the death of Gwen Stacy. It's incredible when you think about that you have this one, not only is he sort of this connecting piece between, sort of the Golden Age and Silver Age as an artist like that, but he bridged that gap and he worked to fundamentally transform the industry twice. I mean, it doesn't get, better than that. And his work on Spider-Man in particular, he was able to update his style a little bit because there's a clear difference between what he was doing on Green Lantern and what he was doing on Spider-Man, to adopt some of that Jack Kirby house style that they were going for, but he fit it into his style. And it's hard to think of any artist in any period, before or after, who mastered just the art of action in comics and kinetic energy on the same level as Gil Kane.
There's you notice he came on to Amazing Spider-Man with issue 88.
Yeah. And
the first storyline was the death of Captain Stacy.
Mm-hmm.
He stayed on the book through 123, which was Gwen's funeral. There's no truth to the rumor that he left the book because there were no more Stacys to kill.
That's pretty crazy. It seems suspicious, Breed. But he's just, as far as a creator, you're thinking, obviously you mentioned Iron Fist, Morbius. We're about to get a Morbius movie. He also kind of took a nondescript ASM character, made him Man-Wolf. So he just, so many kind of contributions to the industry. Jerry Conway himself talked about working with him, but he was saying that, this is a quote, "I quickly learned that working with him," Gil Kane, "Marvel style could result in lopsided storytelling. The first 2/3 of the story would be leisurely paced, and the last third would be hell bent for leather as Gil tried to make up for loose storytelling in the first half." So after doing a few stories with him in my usually loosely plotted style, I began giving tighter plots, indicating where the story had to be such and such a page, and he kind of preferred that. So even Jerry Conway, realizing what he was learning from Gil Kane at the time on how to write a bit tighter story plots and really utilize the Marvel method to their best, to the best degree. And he talked about later on when they were working together, their stories just got better and better, Joe. So it's not just a guy that was there to draw comics. He was obviously there helping work with the younger talent and make them better at what they were doing.
No, absolutely. And, he had assistants too. One of his most notable assistants who worked for him was Howard Chaykin. Howard Chaykin's done interviews fairly recent within the past couple of years where he says, he still thinks of Gil Kane every day to this day, that, he saw a lot of who he was in Gil, this guy who wasn't necessarily, the easiest guy to work with, in the sense that Gil did speak his mind. Gil had opinions on things. Gil wasn't terribly interested in, corporate or any other sort of interference. And Gil was also not only a pioneer in mainstream comics, he was working on doing self-published books before anyone was really talking about it in the same exact way. There have been other people who would pop up and try to do things here and there, but His Name is Savage was one of the earlier attempts at sort of self-publishing. There we go.
1968.
Yeah, and it would later get republished with Fantagraphics, and I believe Stephen Grant through Paper Movies has the rights to His Name is Savage, and has done some follow-ups to that. If people want to check out Paper Movies to look into that, but he was only able to publish one issue, and this is a story that's been that other people have dealt with too when they've tried to do self-publishing decades ago. Is it's hard to get printers, it's hard to get distribution, and that's what happened. He tried really hard. It took him a while to get a printer. Finally gets a printer, then he gets distribution. Then the newsstands only took about 10% of the overall printing, and it just wasn't feasible to continue, even though he had plotted out the next two issues. So this was someone who had such a love for the medium and was forward thinking and was doing the kind of things that, people, it's only gotten easy enough to do these things in the past decade or so that more people are trying that out and trying to get distribution through self-publishing. Even if you go back to the 80s, when you had TMNT and stuff like that, Gil Kane was trying to do that 20 years before.
Mm-hmm.
TMNT and some of these other things, Cerebus and other attempts. So he loved comics. He was forward thinking. He worked on some of the most impactful comics to ever be. His style evolved over time. The Green Lantern stuff is different from the Spider-Man stuff, which is different from the Superman stuff. It's phenomenal to see an artist like that who's able to change and evolve over time, and it's not lowering quality either. It's not like, oh, he did all this stuff on Green Lantern, and then 15 years later he's on Spider-Man, and it's not as good. It's like for a lot of people it was even better. He was an even stronger artist by then. So yeah, he's just so unique in that, and he loved comics in a way that his contemporaries would kind of leave and come back in comics. They'd do advertising for a while, sometimes they'd really make it big there, and they'd only occasionally come back to comics. He stuck it out, and I think to Breen's point earlier about him doing so many covers, I think that was part of why he was like he loved comics so much. So you know what, he'd rather take cover work and other things like that than work outside of comics.
It's crazy, Reed. So if you were a Superman fan in the 1980s, everyone talks about Batman, obviously, which would have been the premier title at the time. If you're reading Action Comics, you're getting Gil Kane and Kurt Swan there for quite a while. Obviously, we talked about the Marv Wolfman Action Comics story where we get to do Brainiac. One of the coolest designs you're ever going to see, specifically the spacecraft with this big skull with all these tentacles. Kind of looks like they might have used some of those designs when they did some things in the Matrix, to be honest. Some of those crafts in there kind of look like they might have been based off of what Gil Kane did within that Action Comic stuff. But it's pretty crazy. As Joe was saying, he never really got worse. He just evolved. Just a really great artist.
Yeah.
No, he didn't. I mean, as he got older, the pencils became looser, and they didn't have this. A Gil Kane book always looked like a Gil Kane book, but just like any other artist, just like Jim Aparo had his prime, and I enjoyed his art past that. But if you read his later Brave and the Bolds, and versus the ones he'd done in the late 60s, early 70s, when he was almost an Adams clone, you realize that his best days were behind him. And obviously Kane's at some point did as well.
Sure.
But there was just always something about him, his art. In fact, I think one of the things that when I first started is that he was doing all the covers. I don't think he was even doing any monthly titles at the time, but I loved his art so much that a friend of mine, I didn't notice art at first. A friend of mine pointed out the difference between Gil Kane and Jack Kirby. And as a 13-year-old, I'm looking at Kirby going, ugh. Looking at Kane and going, yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, I've obviously come to greatly appreciate Kirby, but
sure. And
I think one of the reasons why I stuck with the hobby was because I love this guy's art so much. And so, I guess if it wasn't for Gil Kane, I'm probably not on this retrospective right now. So my apologies for anybody that's going, damn it.
Damn you, Gil.
But no, there's a couple of things about him also real quick. There's a story that I've read in House of Mystery. I think it even pops up on his Wikipedia page, like issue 180 or something, where Mike Friedrich does a takeoff on His Name is Savage, and he does a story called His Name is Kane, where Kane is frustrated with the way his career is going, so he kills his editor, Joe Orlando of EC fame, and who was a current editor at DC at that time. And then Friedrich at the end of the story writes where he takes the portrait of Gil Kane and basically leaves him stuck in a portrait in the House of Mystery for all time. And I thought that was, I always got a huge kick out of that story. Bob Haney did that with Jim Aparo in A Brave and the Bold, where he had, Aparo draw himself and he would come to life or something like that. But I always got a kick out of those kind of stories. And I learned yesterday talking to a friend of mine that Gil Kane always called Howard Chaykin my boy. So they would call, because they had a definitely a mentor mentee relationship that, to Joe's point, Chaykin still thinks about him every day, and
they did get to work together once on the Batman Legends of the Dark Knight.
Yes,
in the early '90s, as well.
But I don't know if there's anybody in comics today that was so uniquely different from his contemporaries as Gil Kane was. And I said, it's there's no mistaking a Gil Kane, Gil Kane art. I mean, I don't care if it's John Romita inking him, Joe Sano. I mean, anybody from the lightest. You cannot camouflage his uniqueness, and that's something I always loved about his art.
Yeah, he's like the David Bowie of comics in a way. He would keep evolving, Even if, like you were saying, like even when he's past his prime or all that, he's still evolving and doing things that are unique and interesting, and he's just been involved in so many important parts of comics that yeah, he's going to continue having a legacy, and he's going to be one of those creators that I think people are only going to appreciate more as time goes on.
Yeah, if you look at his bibliography on just the titles that he's worked on, like the amount of comics that he's illustrated, the page count is good. I couldn't even fathom what it is. It's astronomical. Absolute the amount of work he was actually able to put out. The amount of characters he worked with. So, Breed, I'm glad we were able to talk about this. I'm glad you're able to kind of talk about your favorite comic artist of all time. We might not have a big Eric Breed here if little Eric Breed hadn't realized what an amazing comic artist he was and kept him around in the hobby.
Well, yeah. So a couple things here, real quick. His name is Savage. Kane said that was the story he'd always wanted to do. Archie Goodwin was the writer. Kane helped him plot it, and it's a spy story where Gil Kane or Savage is clearly Lee Marvin's character Walker from Point Blank.
Yeah,
he gets involved with a diabolical plot to kill President Johnson, and he basically have to break him out of jail because no one else can do the job. He goes, it allowed him to do things that DC or Marvel would never let him do, which is like really graphic violence. So it said, so he kind of had that streak in him where he wanted to go a little farther than code approved comics would allow. And for anybody that's wanting to find out anything more about Gil Kane, it's not necessarily a biography. It's more about other creator interviews called Gil Kane Art in, if I read my own writing here, Art and Interviews by a guy named Daniel Herman. But some more easily accessible. Alter Ego magazine did a tribute to Gil Kane a couple of years ago. This is issue 149. Highly recommend it. Yeah, a lot of good information in that.
Nice.
Absolutely. All right, Joe. You had any final words on the career of Gil Kane?
I think the work speaks for itself. If you've never read something that Gil Kane's done, chances are you just didn't realize he did it. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, the death of the Stacys and the early Green Lantern stuff and the stuff we talked about with Superman. If you're enjoying Superman 78, that's the same Brainiac design that Gil Kane came up with. Or if you enjoy, the ship and everything has been used in so many animated series and movies at this point. His work's just been adapted constantly. So many of his designs are designs we still use today. If you're not familiar, do a deep dive. Look into a lot of the stuff he's done. I would be shocked if you were disappointed by what you find.
Absolutely. I do want to say thank you very much to the panel, to Eric and Joe for joining me today, talking about the career of Gil Kane. Obviously, we'll be back next week. I think we're going to talk about another artist who became more of an artist writer, Todd McFarlane. Well, now he's strictly a writer. He doesn't do a whole lot of art, but certainly a little bit of a newer creator, and that should be fun. And thank you very much, and we'll see you then.